everyone. Thank you for joining us for another one of the Wayne Public Library's virtual jazz concert series in 2023. I have the great pleasure and honor to have a chat with the wonderful bassist, Bill Crow. So thank you, Bill, for joining me today.
It's nice to be here.
I want to just point out that there are so many wonderful interviews already with Bill Crow that you can find on YouTube. There's a documentary also about him. So we're going to try to cover some different territory, but there's a lot on Bill Crow as well as by Bill Crow. So this is going to be an experiment. So let's just take off here, and there may be some overlap, but beginning with all the instruments that you play. So if you'll indulge me here, you started off as a singer and
Yeah.
tried piano
Yeah,
with your mother, right?
yeah, that only lasted about a year when I was 4 or 5 years old. I couldn't get both hands to work separately, so I I waited until I was in the fourth grade, and then I took up the trumpet.
And then from trumpet, you moved on to baritone.
Yeah, baritone horn. Yeah.
I think someone recommended a larger mouthpiece was would be more comfortable.
Yeah, I was complaining that I couldn't get enough lip to play the first parts, and I wanted to play the melody in the grade school band. So my teacher looked at my mouth and said, "Well, you may not have a trumpet embouchure." Said the school owns this baritone horn that's got a bigger mouthpiece, and it's three valves that work the same as the trumpet you're playing, so you won't have any trouble. He said, "Take it home and see if you like it." And well, I took it home and fell in love with it. I really enjoyed that instrument. It not only had a beautiful sound and was nice to hold, but the parts that were written for the concert band, a lot of them were taken from orchestral arrangements, and the baritone horns got the cello parts, which were nice counterlines quite often, and I liked that a lot.
So then you kind of took a detour and away from the brass instruments, and all of a sudden now you're into a reed instrument where you're playing your brother's alto sax.
Yeah, well, I wanted to be in the swing band, and there weren't any parts. The same music teacher, I was lucky to have him all the way from the fourth grade till graduation from high school, and he started this little swing band. We were just playing stocks like dance music. So I wanted to be in it, and he said, "Well, there's no parts for the baritone horn." So I knew that my brother Bob he'd gone in the Navy, had left this Busher alto saxophone under the bed. So I got that out and figured out how to play it. And each time I would go to a rehearsal, I'd learn a few more notes on the staff, and the third alto parts were all down right in the staff. So I played that fine all through my junior year in high school. And then we merged with another high school in my senior year, and a whole bunch of good alto players came in from that other school. So I was out of a job, and but the drummer had graduated, so I went over to the filling station where he worked and said, "Show me what you do with a hi-hat and what kind of beats do you play and all of that." And then I got the school owned a drum set, so I got it out, and I liked that well enough that I found some guy that had a second-hand drum set that was really old. The bass drum was huge and had a palm tree and a sunset painted on it and a light inside that made it shine. And the tom-toms were all tacked head tom-toms. You couldn't tune them, and they hung on the sides of the bass drum with D rings, and the cymbal stands were all like a little rod with a right angle and a hook, and the cymbals had thongs that they hung from that hook, which made it very hard to play a ride cymbal beat. I finally found some real cymbal stands and got up to modern style of a drum set. But uh, when I started college the next year over at the University of Washington in Seattle, and nobody had showed up that wanted to play in the swing band, play drums, so I went back during my first semester in college there and played with the Kirkland High School. Well, they changed the name to Lake Washington High School. We had a big contest to see what to name the lake, and I found out that the Indian name for that lake was Duwamish, and I thought that was a perfect name for it, but the politicians didn't like it at all, so they named it Lake Washington, the Lake Washington High School.
So already up through college, you've gone through vocal, a little bit of keyboard, trumpet, baritone, alto sax, drums, and then back to baritone, correct?
Well, when I was a really good baritone horn player. I've been working on it since the sixth grade, and I had a good teacher there, and so I thought for sure when I went to the university that I would get into the band playing baritone. Well, it turned out they had 4 baritone horn players and they didn't need another one. And my freshman year, I was very discouraged. And then they said, "Well, there's an E flat sousaphone here that nobody's playing. And that's pretty close to the it's in a different key, but the parts aren't complicated." So I played that for that semester, and all it was mostly football games, and you sit out in the cold with this cold horn. It wasn't my idea of a fun band at all. Well, then I turned 18 and my draft number came up. So I went in for my interview and they pronounced me 1A. And I said, "Well, when are you going to take me?" The war was over, but they were still taking people in so that they could get the older people that out of, that were up for discharge. They could replace them. So I said, "Well, when are you going to take me?" And they said they couldn't say. And I said, "Well, I don't know whether to start my second semester. I'm between semesters right now, And I said, "What's the shortest enlistment period you've got?" And they said 18 months. I said, "I'll take it." So I enlisted in the Army and went to Fort Lewis, Washington, which is down near Tacoma. And had 8 weeks of basic training, rifle and all that, marching around. And they gave me an application like what my talents were, and I didn't tell them that I had learned to be a butcher and a printer in after school jobs. I just put down all the instruments I played and a couple that I just knew how to open the case, and I thought that surely would get me into a band, but they saw on my high school records that I had taken a half year of typing, so they put me in the office. And it was a dreadful. The job was they put me in the AWOL section as we were keeping track of all the people that had gone home, and they would have to go get them and bring them back. And there was paperwork like mad, discontinuing their allotments to their wives and things like that. And it was 3 of us. There were 2 master sergeants who were waiting for discharge, and me. I was a private. Well, every time one of these guys would finally get his discharge, they would just give me his work, but they didn't give me another person to do it. So it ended up I'm doing these 2 guys both got discharged, and I'm sitting there with this mountain of incoming work, and you have to do reports every morning and fill out all of these forms and get the MPs to go chase these people. And I finally went to the colonel that was in charge of the office there that I was in, and I said, I can't. I'm working overtime and coming in at night sometimes to try to catch up with this, and I just don't have the time to do all this work. I'm doing 3 people's work. And he said, "Oh, well, we'll put in for some assistance." So about 2 weeks later, I get this young corporal who was just out of some training school in the East, and they assigned him to my office. And between the 2 of us working overtime, we caught up on a lot of this work. And I go to the colonel and I say, well, we're all caught up now. And he says, oh, good, because I was worried about you being in charge of somebody with a higher rank than you. And I thought, oh, great, here comes my promotion. He said, so I'm putting you in the file section, and he's going to take care of the AWOL section. Now he's got the problem I had, and I'm in the file section. It's wonderful. It made a gold brick out of me immediately because I could finish my filing work in about an hour, and then I go over to the service club and hang out with the guys, you know. So in one of those hangouts, I ran into a sergeant at the bar, and I'm telling my troubles to him, and he says, "You want to be in a band? I can put you in a band." I said, "How's that?" He said, "Well, they're starting a new one, and they're taking people from all of the different companies who are musicians." He says, "I'll just put your name on the list. They won't know where it came from." And sure enough, 2 days later, I get orders to move to this band barracks. Well, I'm delighted. There's supposed to be 28 people in the band, I think, and they had only found about 12. And we didn't have anybody in charge of us yet. They hadn't. There's supposed to be a warrant officer that's in charge of the band, and they hadn't found one yet. So we would just go out and pick up cigarette butts in the field or whatever, you know, whatever little chores there were, working the KP thing, and me washing dishes or whatever. It's like, when are we gonna have a band? You know? So I got tired of that. I went home and got my. I was only 60 miles away from home. I went home on the weekend and got my baritone. I had gotten this baritone of my own by the time I was in high school. I got an after school job and found out, my dad found out that there was a music store in Seattle that would let me pay for this $75 instrument, $5 a month, I think it was. $5 a month, yeah. Established my credit, and I got this nice King baritone to play. So I went home and got it and brought it back to the barracks, and there was a cornet player there from Brookline, Massachusetts, that was a Dixieland fan. So he taught me all these Dixieland tunes, and I would play tailgate baritone horn, you know. And then by the time we finally got a full complement and really started having band rehearsals, and we got a retired warrant officer that came back. He was glad to come back because his pension was better when he was on active duty, you know. So we only had that band together about a month or two at full complement, and then we get notice that they're changing us from the 53rd Army Band, something like that, to the 2nd Army Band, and we're going to be headquartered at Fort Meade, Maryland. So I said, gee, that's pretty far from home, but that should be an adventure, you know. So everybody was going to get on the troop train and go out there. And I had bought this little Model A Ford, 1930 Model A Ford. This is in 1949, you know, and no, 48, no, 46 that I went in the Army, right out of high school. So my warrant officer and my master sergeant told me, well, if you want to drive your car out there, the Army will pay you 8 cents a mile. And I could drive that car for 5 cents a mile at that time. Gas was only 25 cents a gallon, you know. And so I said, okay, I'll drive. And there was no really time limit on when I had to be there. It was just we're moving out there and we'll see what they give us, you know. So I packed up my car and did I take my drum set? I think I did. I took my drum set with me. The car had a rumble seat, and it was like a little coupe, you know, and its top speed was 40 miles an hour. And so I started driving. I went down to Portland and got on Route 30. There were no super highways in those days. It was just 2-lane roads, sometimes 3-lane roads, which was really weird because you could pass in either direction. You know? Very dangerous. So I would just drive until I got tired and then sleep in the car and then stop and eat and then drive some more. It took me about 4 or 5 days, I guess. And I finally get out there. There was there was uh, there was one superhighway that had been built between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, which is now the Pennsylvania Turnpike. But at that time, it was a railroad right of way that had tunnels built, and it was like a 2-lane highway through the tunnels and a 4-lane highway and the rest of it. And there were signs saying minimum speed 40 miles an hour. Well, that was my maximum speed. So I'm really pushing the car. And when I got to my turnoff down in Maryland, the car was running kind of rough. So I pulled into a gas station that had a mechanic, and I said, something's wrong with my engine. He said, oh man, you came all the way from Washington. That's pretty good. And he said, well, let's see. And he cleans the carburetor. No, that's not it. And he messes with the electrical wiring, I forget what kind what those parts were by now, but he says, no, that's not it. And then he takes the plugs out and he said, oh, here's your problem. The spark, this fourth spark plug is all carboned up and it's not firing properly. So he put it in a little machine that sandblasted it clean, put it back in. The car ran perfect. I said, great, what do I owe you? He says, a dime. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, that's what I charge for cleaning a spark plug. And I said, how about all that other work you did? He says, I can't change you for that, charge you for that. And that weren't what was wrong. So
God bless an honest man, right?
I can't imagine he stayed in business very long. So anyway, I became part of the Second Army Band there at Fort Meade. And we were on tour part of the time because we were in charge of 5. We were the band for 5 states, and they would send us on recruiting tours with a baseball team. So we'd play a concert and at the ball field, and then they would play the game, and it was usually with a brewery team, so we'd get to go have good beer at the brewery. And we had a concert jazz band, sort of concert band and a marching band, and then this little small jazz band that played service club jobs and stuff.
And what instruments were you playing then?
Well, I was playing the baritone horn, and this cornet player said, baritone is not really a jazz instrument. Why don't you get a valve trombone? It plays the same as the baritone, but it sounds more like a jazz instrument, and he named a couple of guys that played it that were famous. So we went into Baltimore to a music store that had all kinds of used instruments, strange, the original Adolph Sax type saxophone that had more keys, and the one-man band instruments and weird instruments. But I found an old Kahn, I think it was, valve trombone. It was 30 years old. I sent in the number to the factory and what it said on the bell, and I got a letter back from saying, well, this says New Haven on it, and we closed that factory 30 years ago, so it's at least that old, but we don't have numbers going back that far, So the metal was already beginning to deteriorate a little bit. If I put the thing down too hard, it would close the tube up. I had to be careful. So I got a stand, and while I was playing jobs at the service clubs, I would keep the trombone by my drums. And if I got a chance to play a chorus, the trumpet player would come over and play the top cymbal while I kept the feet working and played my trombone. And
Did you get paid double for doing drums and trombone?
no, I got all the jobs because all the other drummers in that band were either percussionists or street drummers, and they didn't want to play a trap set. So, and then this master sergeant who wrote arrangements for this little let's see, it was about a 6-piece band, I think. He found all the guys that could play jazz that could double, and then he wrote everything where you had to have like the piano player doubled on trombone, and the bass player doubled on trumpet, and so that none of the other guys in the band could take those chairs, you know. And we used to play for the service club and the officers club, and there were two officers club. One was real, well, straight life officers that were very stuffy, and the other one was for the hospital officers who were all doctors, and they were drunks. They had access to medical alcohol, and so we would go play for them, and they would come and order us to play certain tunes, you know, and they treated us like enlisted men, and we're sitting there in our, you know, privates uniforms. And so we got a letter from the Army headquarters saying that it was all right now for enlisted men to wear civilian clothes when they were off duty. Well, we went down to a Baltimore tailor that this arranger knew. He was from Baltimore, and he made us a good deal. He found some material that we liked and made us all suits that were the same. And when we went and played these jobs at the officer club, now we would wear our suits, and they would request the tunes, and they would tip us, you know. So
That's funny.
that worked out much better.
You mentioned that store where you bought the valve trombone. Is this where you came across another instrument? So let's just recap. You're a vocalist. You played reed, brass, percussion, and now I have a notation that you played the nose. Is this where you found the humanitone?
Actually, I had one of those when I was a kid. It was, you know, we had like kazoos and harmonicas and mouth harps and these humanitone. We called them nose whistles. It was the one I had when I was a kid was folded out of thin metal, and you slipped it over your nose, and then there was a little plate over your mouth with a rectangular hole in it. And when you blew through your nose, it would make the air go over this thing and whistle, and you change the size of your mouth to change the pitch. So you could actually play tunes on it, you know. So this was much later. I was already a bass player, but I was in a music store in Pittsburgh looking for bass strings when I was on the road, and I saw this a little box that said the humanitone. It was a picture of it. It's the same whistle, but it was made out of plastic. It was just a one-piece thing. So I played a tune on it and then bought it and put it in my bass case. And many years later, I was doing a movie score for a movie called "You Are What You Eat." That was Paul. I think Paul Simon was John Simon was the producer, and it was Peter, Paul, and Mary were involved in that some way. But they came out of the booth while we were playing. I was playing Fender bass on that, and they said, "What's the most disgusting sounding instrument you can think of to play the national anthem?" And I said, "I've got it," and I happen to have that in my case. I took it out and played it, and it was just horrible. So they said, "Great!" They recorded it, and I got a double for the date. But they never they edited it out. I found that on YouTube once and played it, and it was nowhere to be heard.
Well, you even got paid for playing the humanitone. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah,
So, so now let's talk about your finally becoming a bass player. And I think this
yeah,
is such a funny story where your friend Buzzy Bridgeford,
yeah.
and you he brought you to New York.
Well,
And
when I got out of the Army, I went back to Seattle and went back, you know, the GI Bill, went back to the University of Washington, and uh, I had my valve trombone, and I had signed up for lessons which I wasn't getting many of. Everything, there were so many soldiers coming back to the university. Like my psychology one class had 110 people in it. We were in a theater, and the guy that ran the class spent all of his time disparaging the guy that had written the book that they had assigned to this class, and then they would test us on the book. So I stopped going to the lectures and just went and read the book and went to tests, But there was a music building that had practice rooms, and after my day's classes, I would go down to one of these practice rooms with my trombone and practice, And I was just practicing some Charlie Parker riffs and things one day, and a knock came at the door, and this young guy, Kenny Kimball, comes in. He's a good piano player, and he says, "Hey, I heard you play, and we have jam sessions up at the other end of the building every afternoon, and why don't you come up?" So I did, and started meeting all the other jazz musicians in Seattle. Now, all the time I'd lived across the lake in Kirkland, I never even knew there was a jazz scene in Seattle. I was a jazz record collector, but I didn't know all this was going on over there. So anyway, through Kenny, I met most of the white jazz musicians that were around in the college, and some of them that were like professionals that worked around town. A couple of piano players that had solo gigs in Chinese restaurants, and then I got a job playing drums at the Cirque Club, and there was a record store right downstairs, and I had gone to a rehearsal. I think we got a new show every week, something like that we had to play for somebody. And I was looking through the Charlie Parker bin in this record store one afternoon, and the girl behind the desk comes over and says, "You must be a musician." Nobody else looks in there. And her name was Janet Thurlow. She was a singer. She later got a job with Lionel Hampton, I think, for a while, and then married Jimmy Cleveland. But at that time, she was just working at this record store, and we chatted a while, and she found out that I didn't know anybody, and she said, "Oh, come over to the Washington Social and Educational Club. You got to meet all the guys." That was a black club, and so we went over there, and Bumps Blackwell had a little band there, and he had a piano player named R.C. and a tenor player named Gerald Bashir, and a trombone player named Major Pigford, and a trumpet player named Floyd Standifer. And so I met all these guys, and well, it's funny. All the guys call this guy RC. I didn't know he had a name other than that. And he was singing like Nat Cole. He had a little trio, and he was singing like Nat Cole, trying to make him buck. And when he wasn't working, he was working with Bumps down at this club. So Janet hauls up and says, "RC, sing the blues," So he sang the blues, and it just tore me up. I was a big fan of blues singers by this time. I'd been collecting records, So when he comes down off the stand, she introduces us, and I said, "Geez, RC, why don't you sing like that all the time?" He says, "Oh man, where I come from, nobody and everybody sings like that." He said, "No, you can't make a nickel singing like that." Well, that was Ray Charles. And it wasn't until about a year later I found out what his right name was, because I was in a diner with a friend, and he said, "Have you heard this Ray Charles record? Just came out." And I said, "Oh, that's not my favorite vocal group. I was thinking of the Ray Charles Singers, And he laughed and put a nickel in the jukebox, and This Little Girl of Mine, when it comes out, I said, "That's RC," So anyway, this little job at the Cirque Club only went. See, the Seattle liquor laws were weird. You had to close at 12. You couldn't sell liquor by the drink, you had to be a private club, and people would bring their own bottle, and they would sell you mixers, and you'd leave your bottle there. They would mark it where where you used it up to the last time you were there. I don't know if they water it or not, but by the time the Cirque Club opened and I got that job, they had just changed the laws so that you could serve liquor if there was a restaurant, but you still had to close at 12 o'clock. And see, the WCTU was very strong there, and the mob loved that because they could have all their after hours clubs as soon as everybody else was forced to close. And all they did was pay off the police. This one guy, Russian John, had about 6 different basement illegal nightclubs, and the cops would come around and collect their money, and about once a month they would close one of the clubs, and it would be in the papers or something, and everybody would feel very good that the police are doing their job. And he would just open the one that had been closed the longest and still have about 6 clubs running. So Buzzy, he showed up on the scene. He'd been in New York. Oh God, he had some story. He was the son of the mayor of Olympia, Washington, I believe, and he was a real rebel. His sister and the rest of his family were very righteous, and he was like a jazz fan and a part-time junkie, and he smoked pot, and he got busted, and his father had bought him a convertible, I forget what kind of a car, fairly expensive, Lincoln maybe, something like that. And because he was the mayor's son, they just took his car and turned him loose, and the father decided that he needed to be sent to military school, so he sent him to one down in Northern California. And Buzzy was a real con artist. He goes to the owner of the military school and he says, look, he said, I can't soldier for you people. So he said, let me tell you what my plan is. He says, otherwise you're gonna lose my tuition. You'll just have to send me home. And he said, I'm only interested in being a jazz musician, and so why don't I study jazz here? And they said, well, we don't have any kind of program like that. And he said, no, I'll create one. He said, the literature I'll read will be downbeat and metronome magazines. And he said, I have a jukebox at home that will move down here, and it's full of the records that I play with, and that'll be my studying. He had all the Count Basie Columbia records and all the Lester Young records and all that, and that was what he liked. So
And
the
he
guy
was a drummer. Was Buzzy Bridgeford a drummer?
Oh yeah, wonderful drummer. He loved Dave Tuff and Joe Jones, and he played like that, and he was one of the best I've heard.
But they
Unfortunately,
went for it. They managed to
he
buy
went
his
for it.
car.
They not only, by this time he'd gotten his wardrobe together, and he was all he was such a good con artist. He was this very very likable guy. And he talked them into driving him down to San Francisco once in a while so he could hear live jazz. It was as part of his curriculum. And in one of those trips, he met a band leader and that needed a drummer, and he quit the school and joined the band, and that was the end of his education. I can't remember the name of the band, but it was a name band at that time, and he's on the road with them, like down through Texas, and then I think it was either Jan Garber or Jan Savitt. I can't remember which band that he transferred to because they were going to New York, and that was how he got to the East Coast. And then it was just as bebop had arrived, and he got to be friend, and he was still a part-time junkie. So he got to be friends with all these other guys that were using junk, Charlie Parker and J.J. Johnson, and the whole crew. And then he got into an automobile accident and had a slight skull fracture. So he went home to Olympia to heal up. And after he was okay, he had come back to Seattle just as I got out of the Army. So that was how we got to be friends. He liked my talent, but he couldn't believe how innocent I was. I didn't know anything about any of the stuff he knew about in the jazz world, So there was an all-girl band that came through Seattle and got stranded. They had bookings in Alaska after their job in Seattle and got notified that the club had closed or something. So they all disbanded, and Buzzy had met her while she was working there in Seattle, and he liked the way she played piano. Betty Christopher was her name. Her real name was Betty Stitt. She was from Chicago, but she had taken Christopher as a more theatrical name. And they became sweethearts. And so he wanted to keep her in Seattle. So he went to one of Russian John's clubs and said, what are you doing with this Hawaiian band in here? You got all kinds, you got all the rounders and gamblers and hookers are all hanging out in your club. You need a jazz band. And the guy says, yeah, maybe you're right. So he hired Freddie Greenwell, a really good tenor player that lived in Seattle, and a bass player named Doug Goss, and Betty on piano, and himself on drums. And so my job finished just as theirs started. So I would run down there with my trombone and sit in. And I ended up playing there every night for nothing. It's just I was having such a good time playing with these guys. They had a kitty. There was a wastebasket with a cat balloon that was inflated with helium, so it would stay up on a string. And the customers would throw silver dollars at the kitty from their tables. They would try to hit it. So we would end up with some money at the end of that. They would split the kitty with me if I played, And Buzzy had a pair of bongos that he owned that were carved out of mahogany with tacked muleskin heads. And Nat Cole had just recorded a jazz record with the bongos. It was the first time that I'd ever heard that instrument. So Buzzy showed me how to play this thing. And besides playing the trombone, I would play the bongos on some tunes. And then when Betty decided it was time for her to go back to New York, he said, well, he was going to come to New York with her, And then he said to me one night, man, he says, this is a weekend town, Seattle. He said, if you want to be a musician, you might as well go where the music is. Why don't you come to New York with me? So that was how I got to New York. We got on the Greyhound bus and came out here.
And it was in New York that you started the bass in Tupper Lake?
Yeah, that was the first year we were here. We scuffled around. I only had $50 in my pocket. And so I knew I was going to have to find a day job of some sort. And I knew how to print. So I did. I found an $8 a week room a block from Birdland. And Birdland only cost 75 cents to get in at that time. And Bird was playing there with Red Rodney and Bud Powell and Tommy Potter and Roy Haynes. And then the house band was all guys that had recorded with Bird. So there was Al Haig and Curly Russell and Max Roach and J.J. Johnson and sometimes Sonny Stitt. Oh, and Red Rodney was with Bird's band at that time. So I would just go down there. You could sit in the peanut gallery all night and not have to buy anything, and I didn't know any place else to go anyway in New York. So, and I would meet a lot of people, a lot of musicians were sitting there listening to these bands. And I would look around and there would be all kinds of famous musicians there because Bird was so popular, and I looked down the bar and there'd be Ben Webster and there'd be Joe Jones, there'd be Lester Young. And I'd say, well, this is New York. I thought it was always going to be like that. But uh, Gene Roland was an arranger and trumpet player that was around at that time. And he had a rehearsal band, and he was always, looking for something that he could hustle up to make some money playing jazz. And he found this job, I have no idea how, in Tupper Lake, New York. It's almost to the Canadian border, at the Altamont Hotel. And he took a quartet up there, and Buzzy was his drummer. So he said, well, man, we're going to be up there all summer. If you want to have a nice weekend, why don't you come up and sit in, and you'll have you can hitchhike up, and I'll put you up in my room. I said, okay. So about a week later, he's back in New York. I said, what's up? And he said, Gene had a fight with the boss's old lady on the opening night, and, and he abandoned the gig and the band. He just went home. So he said, I went to the boss and talked him into letting me hire the band. So he got Freddie Greenwell to come out from Seattle, and he found a trumpet player that he liked because he sounded like Buck Clayton, a guy named Marty Bell. And this piano player that was friends of his and of Dave Lambert, who I had met through Buzzy, John Benson Brooks. He was a songwriter and an arranger and a mystic. And he had a nice apartment up on Riverside Drive that he hadn't left for about 7 years, something like that. His wife was working for the Red Cross or something like that. And so he just stayed. It was like a 7-room apartment, and had a grand piano and a great record collection and his books and all of that. And he played chess. And so Buzzy talked him into coming up and being the piano player on this job. I tell you, Buzzy was a good talker, So I took him up on the thing on 4th of July. I heard that they had decided that they needed an MC to kind of talk to the people and like a tumler. So Buzzy had gotten them to hire this Greek singer we knew, George Vessis, and he was going to hitchhike up there on the 4th of July. And I said, okay, I'll come up with you. Buzzy invited me to come up for the weekend. So we hitchhiking at the 4th of July with suitcases and a trombone. It wasn't getting us any long distance rides. We would get 3-4 miles. So it took us, something like 30 hours, something like that, to hitchhike up there. And we're in sports clothes because it's hot, but by the time we get up there in the valleys of upstate New York at night, we were freezing to death. And we finally get a ride all the way into Tupper Lake and get there early in the morning. And Buzzy gives us a big greeting, and I was just dead tired, so he let me sleep in his bed, and I woke up in time to go down and get something to eat, and then go sit in with the band. So he goes to the boss and says, sounds nice with the extra horn, doesn't it? And he says, yeah, it does, Now, the boss had not allowed him to hire a bass player because I never found out why. He felt that drums and piano were enough rhythm instruments or something. But Buzzy talked him into hiring me as the trombone player. He says, he's very much in demand in New York, but he's got a little spot on his lung, and the doctor told him to stay in the mountains for a while, and maybe you could get him. Well, I looked scruffy, and I don't know how much of that the boss bought, but he said, well, offer him $20 a week in room and board and see how that grabs him. I said, well, manna from heaven, So I came down and I played for a couple of nights, and the room was nice, really decent room, and the board was they only had a few things on the menu there, but we I had to pay for my own breakfast and lunch. And Buzzy had this worked out. He'd found a place that had fresh squeezed orange juice at the drugstore, but their coffee was terrible. So then we would go to this French lady's house that he knew, who made great coffee, but stay away from her bacon and eggs. Have French toast or something like that, you know. And then he knew where all the places were. So about the third day that I was on that job, I come in at night and there's a bass on the stand. And I said, "Oh, did the boss finally break down and let you hire a bass player?" He says, "No, I found a kid that only plays this bass during the school year, and I rented it from him for the summer for $20, and you got to play it when you're not playing the trombone." So I didn't mind, you know, and I knew what the tuning was on the bass from high school, but I had never really, you know, I'd been more interested in the brass instruments. So they
This is
started.
is this your first foray then into string instruments?
Yeah. So but I knew what bass lines sounded like. I've been collecting records, and I had really admired people like Jimmy Blanton and Israel Crosby, and you know, I knew what the bass lines, and I sang bass, you know, so I knew I was good at harmonizing. So I just had to find out where the notes were on the instrument, you know, and I would play like up from the E string to the A string, and then I'd move over and play from the A string up to the D string, and then I'd move over, you know, and on the G string I could work my way up and down it because I didn't know there was a fingering system, anything like that. And they would encourage me. They'd say, you know, like, listen to Ray Brown. He gets that nice long sound. You know, you try to hold the note as long as possible. And Freddie had a tape recorder, and he would tape it sometimes, and then he'd call me in during the day and say, "Listen to this 8 bars on this tune. You really sound like a bass player there." You know, that was as close as they could get to teaching me anything, because they didn't know how to play the bass either. So, but just by doing it every night for the whole summer, by the time I got back to New York, I could offer myself as a bass player. I could play. I knew a million songs because you know, since we first got our first radio when I was 5, I was glued to that radio. And then when I started collecting records, I was glued to my record player. And I remembered all of the standard tunes, but I didn't own a bass. So when we came back to New York, I'd go to Charlie's Tavern and hang around, and somebody would come in and say, "I need a bass player for Saturday night." And I would take it. And then I had found a place over on 6th Avenue, that a little music store. This guy had a bass, crummy old plywood bass, that he would rent for $5 for the weekend. And then there was another place down the street where this guy would rent a tuxedo for $5 for the weekend, and the job would pay $15 or $20. And you know, there was a lot of cheap places to eat around New York in those days, the Automat and the spaghetti joint that we knew. And behind the Brill building, there was a little 6-stool counter where this Greek guy had, Jimmy the Greek. He would sell you a plate of lentil soup and a big piece of bread for 15 cents, you know. Or if you had 50 cents, you could get London broil with Macedonian sauce. You know? so so that became my life, you know. I just and I would hang around all of the places, and I knew where all of the clubs were that you could just walk in and hear jazz. You know, there was a place called Snookies on 46th Street, and most of the 52nd Street clubs had closed by this time, but Jimmy Ryan's was still there, and they had more traditional players there. And there was a bass player named Buddy Jones had moved. I had met him. I'd met his wife, actually. She was a waitress at a jazz club in Washington while I was in the Army, and her husband was Buddy Jones, bass player. who Buzzy knew, and we looked him up as soon as we got there, and we knocked on the door, and Betty comes to the door. I said, "Hey, I know you," and so Buzzy was very impressed that I already knew those people, and Buddy always knew where the jam sessions were. There was a place up in the Bronx that this club had a piano in the back room, and then they would let us, they didn't heat the room, but they would let us play there. So we'd keep our coats on and go up there and play at night. And there was another place at 136th Street and Broadway, a sub basement that was out under the street. So you could play there all night and nobody didn't bother anybody. That was originally when we first found that place, a guy named Gershon. Oh God, I've lost his name. He was a baritone saxophone player. He had it, and when he gave it up, Jimmy Nepper and Joe Maney took it over, and they lived there for quite a while. And Charlie Parker would come by, and if he decided to play instead of just hang out, Jimmy would turn on his tape recorder and tape everything that Bird played, and then he would write it out the next day, and that was his practice for the trombone. And that was only a block from where John Benson Brooks's apartment was, and John let me stay there for a while when we first came back from Tupper Lake. He had a spare room, and
I have some nice notations here that you were learning the trombone, excuse me, the bass as you were going along, and the other musicians would kind of give you their input. But there's a wonderful quote here you have that says, "Birdland was my alma mater. The illustrious professors there who taught by example were some of the world's finest musicians. The dean of all of them was Charlie Parker and Bird."
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that was my. I always tell people, I went to school on the streets of New York, the school of hard knocks, But I did eventually have to get to a teacher because, well, it was funny. Every job was another lesson because they would hire me because I could do something they liked, and I would find that they expect me to do something that I didn't know how to do yet. So I'd have to quick learn it or not keep the job. I think I only turned down one job, which involved a lot of bowing, and I owned a bow, but I didn't know how to play it. So
Didn't Fred Zimmerman teach you how to use a bow?
yes, that was
Harmonic.
some years later. When I got with Jerry Mulligan, he had stuff written that I had to start in the upper register, and I didn't know how to be accurate going directly there. I had to work my way up to those notes. So the only guy that I had ever heard talk about studying the bass was a guy named Trigger Alpert, who had been um, Glenn Miller's bass player during the war. And when he came back, Bob Haggart got him a job on staff at CBS. And I did something over there when I was working with Marion McParland, and he mentioned that this was his practice room during the day, and he was studying with somebody. So I called him up and I said, "Who's your teacher?" And he said, "Fred Zimmerman." Well, Fred was the principal bassist with the Philharmonic then, and a very good teacher. So I went over there one day, and he said, "Well, take out your bow and play me something." And I said, "Fred, I own a bow, but I only use it for the last note. I'm a pizzicato player." He says, "Oh, and you're working." I said, "Yes, that's what I do." He said, "Well," he opens this lesson book that everybody uses, and he says, "We'll start here on page 1. And when you come to something you already know, it'll go faster." And he showed me that there was a fingering system and a bowing technique, and taught me a lot of things about the instrument itself. I didn't know how to take care of a bass. Well, by that time, I had found my own bass. There was a guy that I met in Charlie's Tavern that was looking to sell a K bass, plywood bass. And I went up and looked at it, and it was in pretty good shape. And he only wanted $75 for it, Well, he could have said 75,000 at that time because I only had $5, but I gave it to him and said, will you hold this for me till I can get the rest? So at that time, John Benson Brooks met this trombone player named Mike Riley. I don't know if you ever heard of the tune, The Music Goes Round and Round. That was a
Yeah.
famous tune in 1930. It sold the most sheet music of any tune that had ever been written before, because they played it on the radio for New Year's Eve, and everybody had the radio on for dancing, and this tune had a hard bridge, so they all went out and bought the sheet music the next day. And well, this guy had been through the wars. He was a comedian as well as a trombone player. And first time I met him, he plays a high F on the trombone. He says, "That's a high F." He says, "You think anybody cares?" He says, "You got to get the laughs." So he had all of this. He used to work with a comedy band, but he was trying to recoup some money that he owed one of the booking agencies or something. He had a club in LA that folded. And so anyway, I don't know how he met John Benson Brooks, but John knew that I sang. He was looking for a singing drummer to make this trio, and John knew that I sang and had played drums. So he called me up, and I said, "Geez, I don't even have a drum set," And he said, "Well, get one, and we'll audition for this guy, see if he wants to hire you." So I went to Maurice Mark and borrowed a set of his drums, and we went over to NOLA Studios, and I played drums and sang. It was just trombone, piano, and drums, and he hired me. And the jobs he had were like Monessen, Pennsylvania, Troy, New York, little funny little clubs. And he would do all of his comedy shtick, and he would expect me to be his straight man. And he would get started on things that everybody knew in vaudeville, but I didn't know what the routine was, so I'd have to say, like, don't start something that I don't know, but he would get carried away sometimes, and the routines would fall flat because I didn't know what the punchline was or what the setup line was. And he would always hit me with his hat, and he'd say, "Now Billy's going to sing. What do you want to sing, Billy? If he's going to sing, if." He would always say that, and I'd have to sing that same damn song over and over again. I didn't even like it, and but we, out of the $80 a week he was paying me, and we were staying in furnished rooms and cooking in the room on a hot plate, hamburgers. I was able to save out $5 every time he paid me and send it to this guy in New York to pay for my bass. And as soon as I had the bass paid for, I quit Mike. And he's saying, he says, "Oh, I'll pay you $90 a week if you'll stay." I said, "If I'm worth $90 a week, you should have been paying me that all along." And he says, "Oh, I know what it is. You're mad that I hit you with the hat," because I had asked him to please stop that, because he did a lot of water jokes, eyes that I'd have to blow water through a tube, and the water would come out while he sang "I Cried for You," and so the hat was always wet, and when he hit me with it, it felt like it weighed about 3 pounds, So, so no, I finally got rid of that job and got home and bought my bass, and I was on my way.
So that was your first bass, but then when did you get the bass I believe you're playing now, the French bass?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I found that there was a good bass maker and repairman on 6th Avenue, and that I can't remember what I needed to do. I met this English bass player, and he said, "I don't think your sound post is in the right place. You can get more sound out of this bass if it's properly adjusted. And he took me over to this guy, and he adjusted it, and while I was there, I saw all these other basses that are apart, and I'd never seen the inside of a bass before. And he had a lot of different work going on, and I got to be friends with him. And so one day, I had gotten this job with Marion McPartland at the Hickory House on 52nd Street. It was my first steady job in town. And she's putting me through all these changes because she likes to play in every hard key in the world, especially if she's playing a ballad. She would at least modulate 3 or 4 times. And some of the keys were really tough on the bass because there were no open strings, or not many. And I didn't have a fingering system and I wanted to get the sound that I liked, and by holding the string down well. But so this guy comes in with a bass, and he says, "You got to buy this bass." And I said, "What's up?" And he said, "Well, I got a really expensive English bass coming in." He had a deal with the guys that worked on the band on the Queen Mary, and when they would bring basses over and sell them in New York, where they could get more money for them than they cost when they bought them in London. So he said, "I got this really fine pedigreed bass coming in, and I need cash." And so he said, I said, "Well, what do you want for it?" And he said, "Well, give me $150 and your bass. Yeah, I can sell it for something." So I drew 2 weeks' salary from Marion and bought this bass, and it's been my bass ever since. It's been through the wars, but it's really been my voice.
So that's a nice segue for us to start talking about the style that you then were able to develop. And there's an article from that I have here where the description of your style is that you developed a reputation for being a warm, straight up, muscular player. His sound was thick, punchy, and pronounced, making him a forceful timekeeper for both the ensembles he was in and the tap and feed of the audiences. Was that developed with playing with Marion McParland, or prior to that, or after
Well,
that?
it developed along the way. I could hear the bass lines I wanted to play. Sometimes I couldn't find the note. I remember one time during the first year that I was playing, I got a chance to play with Hank Jones, who is one of my favorite piano players. And I would play a note that I hadn't intended to play, and instead of him looking at me like you made a mistake, he would say, "Oh, thank you," and he would use it to reharmonize the tune. He would give him an idea. Just some musicians are, but I was really running. I was always almost every job I was on, I was the least experienced and least capable musician on the band. I was playing with really fine players. And for some reason, if you just had a bass and were standing on the corner, you would get asked to play. Now, before I got my bass, I used to go to jam sessions with my trombone. And then if the bass player got tired, I'd go over there and play on his bass. Teddy Kotick was always very kind that way. He had a tough bass to play. It had high action. I didn't know anything about adjusting the action or anything like that, but I just knew. There was one time I started to look at my finger and I said, "Oh, I'm starting to get a blister. I better cool it." And the tenor player says, "You're a bass player. You're supposed to bleed."
So one of the things that came up in the documentary about you, which is named Bill Crow, Jazz Journeyman, and the link will be included at the end of this interview. Michael Cannon described how you were able to create a spontaneous counterpoint to the soloist improvisation, and I believe you did that quite a lot with Jerry Mulligan when he was soloing, and that you guys had a very simpatico relationship where you harmonized and had counterpoint off one another. Would you like to
You
talk
know,
about that?
yeah, well, Jerry had started that when he had the quartet with Chet Baker in California, uh, of not using a piano. there are a lot of different stories about why that was, that the piano wasn't very good or there wasn't room for it on the bandstand or something. But Jerry explained on one of the interviews I saw that he always liked to play backgrounds to the other soloists, and he kept that throughout his whole life, even when he started using a piano toward the end of his life. He felt that the piano player was sitting there playing chords, and sometimes he didn't want to hear that. He just wanted to hear the counterpoint that he was playing as it matched the bass and the solo instrument. So he stopped hiring piano players. So by the time I joined the band, he had worked that out pretty well. I joined when he'd put together a sextet with Zoot Sims and Bob Brookmeyer and John Erdley on trumpet and Dave Bailey on drums. And I always had heard bass lines as sort of bass melodies, and I liked it when I could think of a line that really matched what the rest of the band was doing, whatever size the band was, because I could hear the chords coming, and I could kind of anticipate a melodic bass line. Once in a while, Jerry would say, "What are you doing playing my note?" I'd say, "What makes it your note?" And he'd say, "Well, you're supposed to hang around the roots and fifths, and I hang around the sevenths and ninths and farther up the chord, So I got the idea, and sometimes we would get parallel lines going in a tenth, which is nice because it implies all the notes in between the root and the tenth, and it was just very satisfying because it was different every time you played,
One of the things I'd like to talk to you about is the importance of the relationship between a bassist and the drummer, because the bass and the drum are the core elements of the rhythm section, and they provide the basic pulse and groove of a song, and then can be augmented by other instruments such as piano or guitar. But I'd like to talk to you about some of the drummers that you played with throughout your career, in no particular order, and just how your relationship was with them and how you connected in playing with them. So
Sure.
let's just start with Joe Morello when you played with Marion McPartland at the Hickory House.
Well, by the time I got to Joe, I really had developed a point of view about the relationship between bass and drums because I'd played with some really good drummers, and Joe was he had so much technique, and he had great big hands, so he had such control of the sticks and brushes, and Marion was always encouraging him uh, to stretch out, and do his thing. Sometimes we would have to count like mad because on his fours he would get so complicated we didn't know where one was anymore. And but
Yeah, I read somewhere else that he was adept at polyrhythms and cross rhythms.
yes, and he would try to lose us. He had a funny attitude, and but we both seemed to agree on where the center of the time was, and we just locked in together and always enjoyed playing time together because it felt good, but see, when I was still in Seattle, Buzzy Bridgeford would send me in as his sub once in a while. He had a job with an organ player, his drums and organ, and he had set up all these drums. He was a little guy, but he had set up all these drums, some cymbals he couldn't reach, but the set looked great, And then when he would play his solos, he would really get. He wasn't a Buddy Rich type player at all. He was a Dave Tuff, if you know who that was. He was like a simple swinger and with interesting ideas, but not loud and not busy, Buzzy hated anybody that he felt overplayed, So one night we're sitting up at his apartment, and he says, "What do you think of when you're playing the drums?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, trying to keep the time steady and try to find cymbal beats that the soloists like." And see, and just keep it going. And he said, well, what about swing? And I said, well, I know that word, but I'm not really sure that is as far as playing it. Well, he got out 3 or 4 different records, Count Basie, Avenue C, Dodo Marmarosa, a trio record called Mellow Mood, and a couple of Duke Ellington V discs that he liked a lot. And he put these things on and he danced all around the room to the music and showed me where all of the little picks were and everything, and the grace and smoothness of it. Well, it just was like a revelation. I still think of that when I play. And and then he put me on to which drummers to listen to, like listen to Shadow Wilson on this record and listen to Kenny Clark on this record and see what this guy. So by the time I got to New York, I got a chance to play with guys like Kenny Clark and well, the first job I did with Stan Getz, Roy Haynes was living in Boston and the gig was in Boston. So he hired Roy and I got to play a week with Roy Haynes. Now, I had heard him when I was in the Army playing with Lester Young down in Baltimore. And I thought he was the most modern drummer I ever heard, and he still is. but all these guys had a time feel. I got to play with Joe Jones, and I had admired him on record so much that it was just thrilling to really feel that in person. Some drummers, well, Gus Johnson was a good example. He was with us for about a year when I was with Jerry.
That was part of the quartet with Jerry Mulligan, right?
Yeah, I met him when he was with Count Basie, and I got to hear that band. It was the New Testament band. They had just reformed after he'd had an 8-piece band, and Gus had a cymbal beat that was like right on the nose, ding, 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 ding. But when he played figures with the band, which tended to lay back a little on the time to get a certain phrasing quality, he would phrase with them, but he would keep that time going, while he was decorating around the drums. And I thought that was perfect. It really, because the worst thing that can happen is for the time to start to slow down or to rush, either one. Now Dave Tuff was not a metronomic player. He said he didn't care if the time changed a little bit, if the tempo changed a little bit, as long as the feeling was good, and he knew how to put that in there. The only trouble I ever had was when I was with Stan Getz. I was with him for 6 months, and we started out with Roy that first week, and then Frank Isola was the drummer, and I got along famously with him. We both had the same time feeling. And then Kenny Clark, and he was a little different, but I really enjoyed finding a way to fit in with what he was doing. And then all those people disappeared, and it was just Stan and me. He said, I got to start a new band. Who should we get? So I recommended Bob Brookmeyer. I had heard him on a jam session, and he poked around and found Johnny Williams on piano and Alan Levitt on drums. Now, these two guys I never could figure out how to play with, because Johnny Williams was way up on the front end of the beat, like, come on, come on. And he loved Horace Silver, so he shuffled a lot, and there was just no denying where he was trying to put it. But Al Levitt wanted to relax everything, so he laid back a little. And Johnny would be saying, come on, come on. And I'd try to play up with him, and he wasn't satisfied, and I wasn't happy there. And then I'd try to get back with Al where it was groovier, and Johnny would get, so they finally solved the problem by firing me and hiring Teddy Kotick, who had been Stan's bass player before I joined him. So I went and took the gig Teddy was doing with Claude Thornhill's band, and I learned a lot there because I was having to read music, and especially Claude's theme song was through a tenth in D flat, which means there's no open strings. Do 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 dee 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 dee, and it's a lovely line to play, and I couldn't play it without shifting for every note in that key, and it was coming out dum 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 dum, and I didn't like that at all. So, and he's playing it on the piano with that nice legato touch. So after the first night with that band, I went home and sat on my bed and said, "Geez, how come I'm not other bass players seem to be playing easier than I am, I still hadn't started studying with anybody yet. And so I plotted out those notes and found that by starting on a different finger on a different string, I could do it with just two shifts, and no, just one shift, do 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 do, instead of five. and and that started to get my hand around in the right position. So when I started studying, I was already ahead of the game because I wasn't grabbing it like this. But see, when I was a kid in high school, I was running out of the music room down 2 or 3 little stairs, and there was a door that had 4 glass panes in it. And for some dumb reason, as I'm running out, the kid ahead of me slammed the door, and I put my hand up and it cut my wrist. All of the tendons that do this, and the nerve that's for that side of the hand, and then there was another cut here for this finger. And I ran, had somebody put a tourniquet on my arm. We ran down to the doctor, and he put a compress on it and sent me to Seattle to this genius of a surgeon who put this all back together again. And now, after it's healed, I could only close my hand about that far. So I had to stop playing the saxophone. I couldn't see the key. I couldn't feel anything with those 2 fingers. And so I probably could have, if I'd had sense enough to mention that when I went for my Army physical, I probably could have stayed out of the Army, but I was too dumb to think of it. So anyway, that remained a problem. The first year that I got to New York, I was interested in the writings of Wilhelm Reich at that time, and I decided that I would go to one of his physicians that was like a psychiatrist and medical doctor, and during one of the sessions, I was crying about something, and all of a sudden I felt like this electric shock was going down my arm, and it went all the way out this finger that didn't feel anything. And from then on, the nerves started to heal up. He had told me when the surgeon, when he fixed it, he said, "I've reconnected the sheathing for the nerve, and sometimes it'll heal and sometimes it won't. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it never happens." Well, it healed. And then playing the bass strengthened that little finger. It still feels a little bit different than the other fingers, but I can feel touch, and the bass playing made it strong, especially when I got around in the right position. When I first started playing, I wasn't using that finger at all. I was playing with my fourth finger, and shifting all the time. But it was a miracle. It was wonderful.
So what was it like to play with Dave Bailey?
Oh, Dave was great. I had never met him when I joined Jerry's sextet that Brookmeyer recommended me, and Peck Morrison was leaving, I think, to go with Johnny Hodges or somebody. And so I met Dave, and we sat down and started to play, and it was just exactly what I sometimes Jerry would lay back a little in order to be able to execute something he was trying to play, and so that it would curve away from the time a little. and Dave and I would both lean into the wind just slightly to keep it where it belonged, and it was just like a perfect match. We never had any trouble playing. And then when we played with Bob Brookmeyer and Clark Terry's quintet, we also had that nice relationship. It was good.
When you played with Mel Lewis, I had a notation that he would pitch his bass drum to a different tone. So was that something that the drummers that you frequently play with did to their drum
Well,
kit?
I was lucky. Most of my early playing, the drummers were using like 20-inch drums, 22 maybe. And as a result, whatever note that they were playing, it was always lower than my lowest note. It was just a thud, you know. But now what's gotten popular lately, mainly just because it's easier to get the bass drum into your car. The guys have started using 15, 16, 17-inch drums. And those, if you tighten them up, they have a pitch that's right up in my bass register. So I appreciate it when they will damp that a little bit so that it doesn't ring. So if I'm trying to play a B flat, I don't want to hear their B.
So speaking of Mel Lewis, it's a nice segue for me to talk about the fact of some travel you were offered and travel that you've actually accepted. So you were offered to travel with Dad Jones, and you turned that down.
Well, yeah, that was much later. Actually, I was on the road quite a bit with Jerry, and I was probably lucky that he had a lot of spaces where he didn't work, or I would have never developed a home life, you know. That's the reason a lot of the guys on Ellington's band who Duke wanted to stay on the band didn't, because they didn't want to be on the road forever like that band was, you know. I know Lloyd Trotman is a very good bass player. He only stayed with Duke for about 4 months while he was around New York, but he didn't want to go on the road because he just got married and he wanted his home life, you know.
So one of the tours that you did, it was a 6-week tour to Russia with Benny Goodman. This is in 1962. So this must have been just shortly before or shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in the mid to end of October of 62.
Yeah, I was in Europe on a tour with Norman Granz when that happened, and it didn't seem like any big deal. We were in Paris and nobody was paying any attention to it at all.
So it seemed like a good time to then go to Russia.
Well, yeah, you know, it was funny with that. I mean, I've written extensively about that. It's on my website if anybody wants to read about it. But in short, Benny had not had a band for a while, you know, and the State Department had been looking for somebody to send to Russia. They wanted Duke to go. Russians weren't too sure about that, an all-black band. And they had heard about the riots at Newport that one year where the rock and rollers all came and pushed this fence down and all that. And they were afraid that it would be too uncontrollable. So they chose Benny because Benny had a reputation for not only being very popular in this country, but not having anything wild, and that he also played classical music.
Right.
So the State Department worked out the Iron Curtain was getting a little softer then, and Khrushchev was in power, and so they arranged that we would do concerts in several different cities, and that Benny would perform a clarinet concerto with the Moscow Philharmonic. So and Benny was perfectly capable of doing this because he'd played all that music, you know. But rather than just saying, "Well, I'll do the Mozart," he said, "Well, I'm not sure," and he gave them about 5 different concertos that he would be willing for them to choose, you know. And But by the time we got over there, uh, he was just dealing with them via the embassy people. I don't think he had any meetings with the orchestra leader. But he kept changing his mind which one he was going to do. So uh, he changed his mind twice while we were in Moscow, and then when we went down to Sochi, he changed it again. And then we got word that the Moscow Philharmonic must have thought he was putting them on or something. They just canceled. Now, now the diplomats from our country are going nuts because they've got to have something classical going on here. So they find out that Byron Janis is going to be in Leningrad when we're there. So they arrange that they'll get the Fruity Grofé arrangement of Rhapsody in Blue, and Byron will play it with us at one of the concerts there. Well, it turned out to be a real fiasco because there were problems that didn't get solved at the one of the two rehearsals they had scheduled, and the second rehearsal was on the day of the concert, and Benny canceled it and went fishing. And so Byron ended up having to conduct with his left hand, and he was furious, so he didn't play very well. It was a real, the band was so embarrassed, and Benny didn't seem to mind at all. Yeah.
It makes me wonder. So Louis Armstrong was part of the Jazz Ambassadors, and that started in the late '50s and continued into the '60s.
Yeah,
Why were they not selected to go to Russia, or were they trying something new?
it was an all-black band.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So how are you? How was the band perceived and received as Americans in Russia?
Very well by the people. The first night in Moscow, we got this very restrained applause, and we saying, what happened? We heard that there were a lot of jazz fans in Moscow, you know. Then we realized if you were a politician and couldn't get a ticket for this concert, you were pretty low on the thing. These people were all, it was like having the House of Representatives at your jazz concert, you know. So about the third night, then the jazz fans got in, and we were received very, and they were so afraid that the fans would rush at the stage or something like that, or you know, all that Bobby Soxer stuff that they had shown in the movies, that they had guards standing in front of the stage facing the audience to keep them in control. And if anybody came and talked to us at the bus or something like that, we would see them hustling them away. You know, it was a strange combination of attitudes because the local musicians couldn't have made us more welcome, and they found places for us to play together. You know, and it was all. But that band we're talking about, drummers, Mel Lewis was a remarkably good big band drummer because he he didn't emulate Buddy Rich or all the guys that catch everything and play everything that the band is playing. You know, he would find a nice groove and a nice sound, and he would just keep that strength underneath the band without getting too loud. He had a great sounding cymbal, an old broken cymbal that had a crack in it. And he told me one time, he says, I don't like to play what the brass section plays. He says, it makes them lazy. He says, because they got enough, they can swing enough by themselves if they get up on it. You know, he says, I'd rather play what the saxophones are playing. You know, so I got a chance to play with him a lot because uh, when Jerry put his big band together, Mel was the drummer, and when I joined that band, the band was in great shape. Brookmark had almost handpicked the band, and Clark Terry had just joined same time I did. Buddy Clark and Conti Candole had been with the band, and they went back to California when they finished a European tour, and Mel decided that he wanted to stay in New York. So that band was so good, nobody would send in a sub. Even Clark Terry, who was a very busy recording musician, he liked it so much that he would turn down record dates in order to not miss a gig that we had at the Vanguard or something like that. And then Jerry lost the deal that he had with Norman Granz, which was supporting that band. Norman sold Verve Records, and the deal was off. So he had to cancel the band. He didn't have anything booked, and went back to working with a quartet. But we liked the band so well that we kept playing once a week up at Lynn Oliver's rehearsal studio. And so I was playing with Mel all that time. And then once in a while, Jerry would get maybe like 2 or 3 weeks at Birdland and then a record date. And that was all with Mel. And except toward the end there was one time where Mel was doing something else. And so I got Gus Johnson on the band. And I knew him from working opposite Bassist band at Birdland. And I really liked the way he played. But Mel had, well, with Jerry's band, Mel and I were the rhythm section. That was it, you know. Once in a while, Jerry would play the piano, but in general, that was it. And it was so interesting to find the center of his time and just lay the notes right down with him. The only change I ever heard in his tempos was to slow down slightly. I never heard him rush ever, but once in a while things would get into such a strong groove that he would just lower the thing slightly so that it could swing a little harder, you know. And I always agreed with him.
What you're describing, and it's something I've talked about in other interviews, is that alchemy that happens on a bandstand where musicians get together and it's just simpatico, and it truly is like a chemistry. And there's a great Art Blakey quotation here where he says, "Jazz, as he would remind his audience, was the eighth wonder of the world because no one knew in advance what a jazz musician was going to play, least of all the jazz musicians. It's music," he said, "that comes direct from the creator of the artist to the audience in a split second." And it is magic. And what you're describing in your relationships with these drummers, and of course others in a sextet or a quartet or a big band, it really is an amazing thing to me that will always surprise me.
Yeah, well, that's the delight of the game, is that I'm very fortunate in the position that I have as a bass player that I'm almost always playing. They rarely ask you to lay out, and every measure is a matter of choices. You know, you have all of these 12 notes that you could be playing at any one time, and that's Ron Carter's, the title of his book is Finding the Right Notes. You know, it's just, that's the game, you know, always trying to find both what pleases your ear and what might please the people you're playing with, and then what might please the audience, you know, but it's in that order.
So was it a big change then for you when you started to play in pits for Broadway shows? You were with the King and I for quite a while. Is there a
Eight
different
and a half
demand?
years.
Well, that's quite a while, yes. So there's different demands on you as a musician, though, when you're playing in a pit because you have a book that you really can't stray from. So did you find that um, relaxing to do, or how did you take to it?
Oh, it's a different problem. The reason I took it was because it was work, and I love to play, and as long like both of the long runs that I did the King and I for 2 years, and I did 42nd Street for 8.5 years, and both of those orchestras were put together by somebody who knew the musicians' abilities, and oh, even though you're playing the same thing every night, it's fresh. It's fresh in a way because it's alive. It's more interesting than a recording because people breathe differently from day to day and feel differently from day to day. The whole orchestra, and you support each other and you support the stage. And I had a lot of things just to entertain myself. The Phantom of the Opera had just opened. In fact, they chased us out of a theater. We started in that theater, and there was one scene where Peggy Sawyer comes down to the front of the thing in 42nd Street, where she's looking right into the pit in the audience, and I was sitting with my back to the audience next to the conductor, so I'm looking right at her. So I started making little masks out of paper cups or something like that, or every night she would look down and there would be something different, and then she'd have to keep a straight face. And then to entertain my subs, first I started just entertaining the rest of the pit and the guys in the pit. There would be a line on stage, and it would make me think of a funny cartoon I could draw using that line. So I had a little pad, and I'd draw the cartoon and pass it around. Dick Perry was one of our trumpet players. The ones he liked, he kept. So I ended up putting a lot of them in my book to entertain my subs when they came in. They'd have something to amuse them. I've still got a collection of some of that stuff.
It's unfortunate, though, that the trend seems to be with Broadway shows is to have a much more abbreviated band for orchestra. And I was really blessed to go see the revival of Sweeney Todd recently. And it's the first time they're performing that since '79 with the full orchestra. And I have to tell you, having seen that original in '79 and seeing this revival, it makes a huge difference to have that full orchestra.
Sure. Well, the union's been fighting that for years, and we were able to negotiate minimums for certain theaters, but they managed to get some exceptions into the contract. Like if it was something for the Beatles, we shouldn't have to have a full orchestra, and so they've been whittling it down a lot, and in some cases, like with Cats, they put the orchestra in a separate room with a TV monitor, so nobody knows that it's live music, and even with what's the one with the Lion King.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a notice on Facebook that the bass player had gone into a restaurant or something after the show and heard some people talking about the Lion King or saw their programs or something, and he went over and said, I'm glad you enjoyed the show. I just played bass for it. And they said, oh, we didn't know it was live music. So we've got the pit covered,
That breaks my heart, actually.
Yeah.
I always found it very important in any show to applaud the orchestra, and I always am grateful when the opportunity arises. So,
Yeah.
so one of the things I want to talk to you about is we'll jump off to where you talk about the fact that your typing in the army took precedence over your music, but it did give you a good basis for your writing career, which is quite as extensive as your music career. It's incredible. So you have two books out. I do have one here, and I'm hoping it'll be able to be seen on the. I don't know if it's being shown. You can see
I
it
can
on.
see I can see it. It fades in and out.
Yeah, so it's your first book, Jazz Anecdotes, and I believe this is a first edition of that. And then your other one is from Broadway to
Birdland Broadway.
Broadway to Broadway, excuse me. And so I highly recommend everyone to get copies and to read them. But you also kind of started as a columnist, and that's kind of what bridged you to being a book writer. And I just want to add in very quickly for any of those in the that are book lovers in the audience here is that the very famous Japanese writer Haruki Murakami translated both your books into Japanese. So
Yeah.
you must be extremely proud of that.
Yes, I am. And it has stood me in good stead with the Japanese audience, which is extensive, the jazz audience. Uh, uh, I was doing a record date with Claude Williamson for a Japanese label, and I mentioned to the owner of the record company that I had gotten this translation from Murakami, and he said, "Oh, great, we'll do a CD." You know, he put it out at the same time that the book came out in Japanese. And then I saw him at another record date a little later and said, "You know, he did my other book." He said, "Great, we do another CD." So I have two CDs in my own name with my own quartet because of his translations.
You're a very natural writer, and it's just a joy to read them. And you write like you speak, and it's that's a talent in its own. But also you're not you're sparse in what you're writing. I think you, as I've read, took Strunk and White to heart, and we're trying not to be using too many words that were not necessary.
Well,
Strunk and White is a hard one.
I taught myself to be an editor, and that was part of the joy of writing those books. Was the after I got both of them written, I must have spent more time editing than I did writing. Um, I was lucky. I had a couple of good school teachers when I was a kid. In the sixth grade, I had a woman who was loved to make trips to New York and to Hawaii, and she was a reader, and she turned me on to James Thurber and E.B. White and Benchley and all those New Yorkers writers, and and it was through White talking about writing and a lot of his writings that I developed a point of view about the the simple declarative sentence, you know, getting rid of the ing words and all of that. And I've always been you know, when I was a little kid, my mother taught me to read before I started kindergarten, and so they put me right in the second grade when I started school, and that put me behind in everything else. But but I was a reader. We had a little library in Kirkland that the ladies' club had built, this little building that was half library and half their meeting room and entertaining room. And by the time I graduated from high school, I had read every book in that library. I used to go in there when I was 6, you know, and check out books. I finally got to a point where I was interested in Greek mythology, and the books were huge. And I had to get a note from my mother that said I wasn't pressing flowers or something in these books, and I was really reading them.
Well, that served you well, and I tell you, E.B. White makes it sound easy to write the declarative sentence, and you make it look easy in your writing. But as a wannabe writer myself, I know it's almost very hard, impossible for me to do, if not very hard for everyone else. So, so one of the other things you did as a writer is that you answered fan mail for Jerry Mulligan as the unofficial spokesman for the group. I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious what letters you received from fans at that time.
Oh, he had a stack of stuff on his mantle that I said, "Look, this is from France. This is from Germany. This is from Sweden. You know, did you ever answer these?" No. I thought, "Oh man, you know, let me have this part of the quartet. You know, I'll answer all of these letters and you just sign the answers. Okay. So I had a nice conversation with a lot of people who thought they were talking to Jerry.
Oh, if anyone's watching this, so you might have broken somebody's heart there, but what kind of questions would they ask?
Oh, it's so long ago, I really don't remember.
So you are also a composer, and in fact, I was just listening before we connected here to one of your songs, which is Blueport on the Jerry Mulligan and the concert jazz band of the Village Vanguard. And how did you come to
Oh,
composing that?
no, that one is char is Art Farmer's tune. We were doing that Columbia album of quartet things. And so Art wrote a tune and I wrote a tune, and Jerry named them. He named Art's Blueport and mine's is called News from Blueport.
Oh,
He
there's
loved
a lot of
he
misinformation on the internet there, so we'll have to
yeah,
correct that.
he likes spoonerisms, so I got stuck with it.
Do you still compose, or did you enjoy composing?
Well, it's kind of like carving in stone. It's a slow process. Um, when I got a chance to do those two CDs, I had to write a couple of tunes so that I could name them for the books, you know. So there's one tune called From Birdland to Broadway and one called Jazz Anecdotes. And I enjoy it. I've written a couple of other tunes. I've enjoyed it, but I haven't gotten into the business of getting people to record them and get royalties and all that sort of thing.
So there was a notation that you were playing at the Newport Jazz Festival, and you're part of the Jazz on a Summer's Day recording when you were playing with Jerry Mulligan in '58.
Mhm.
You also played the Newport Festival in 1956 with Dave Brubeck and JJ and Kay. So, do you have any great memories or anecdotes from that time?
Oh, uh, I remember I was there the year that Duke Ellington let Paul Gonsalves play 27 choruses, and it sort of revived the interest in his band. Uh, but I'm not sure if that was the same festival. We were all sitting around. We were staying at this one hotel they had in Newport, and it was a nice hot day, and everybody was down at the swimming pool. And Sonny Rollins came down in a bathing suit, and he had a white sailor hat pulled down over his ears, and he kept that hat on all afternoon. And then when we went to hear him that night at the festival, uh, he had the hat off and he had a mohawk haircut. Was, it was just a strip of hair. So he didn't want anybody but to see it until he got on stage. So it was some years later. Uh, we were playing down at the half note with Bob Brookmeyer and Clark Terry, and Sonny walked in and he was dressed like a working cowboy. He had a Stetson hat with sweat on it and a Levi jacket that was threadbare, and you know he really looked like he just came in off the ranch. Yeah. Dave Bailey leans over to me and says, "I guess Sonny found out the Indians didn't win."
What was it like to play with J.J. Johnson and Kay Winding?
Oh, well, I only played with them that short time. They were just getting ready to break the band up. So their bass player had left. I don't even know who it was, but the band was Kenny Clark and Dick Katz and me and J and K. And we were at Basin Street West for a couple of weeks. And then Jay he had a jingle business going that it was kind of keeping him busy, and Kay was putting together a 4 trombone band, and so the first night that we played together, Kenny Clark was saying, "Oh man, I got a toothache," and he was playing all right, but he was really not feeling like playing. And J&K had so many hits that they'd played over and over again that they were tired of them, so they were just kind of phoning in their parts. And uh, uh, oh god, it's getting me. I can't think of people's names. Uh, from the West Coast, this wonderful tenor player, trombone player, had come in to be part of Kay's new band, and Carl Fontana, and he had his horn with him. So they said, "Well, come on up and play." So Carl came up, and he knew all of these hits that they had recorded because everybody knew them. And so he just faked in a third part, which was two-part harmony. All of a sudden sounded so rich with the third part. And then he took the first set of solos and he played so good that J&K said, "Wait," and they woke up and started playing, and Kenny started playing. It was a great night after the first set.
That's
and
wonderful to
then,
hear.
then we recorded and we played Newport, and that was the end of the gig.
So you mentioned jingles. You were also involved in commercials and recordings for jingles, and then you were also an actor and a model as well. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I had the steady job at the New York Playboy Club with Walter Norris's trio, and started out as a quartet. We had Bobby Donaldson was the drummer, and Jerome Richardson was the tenor player. And they only stayed about 2 weeks, and then they both sent in subs, and the subs were Ray Mosca and Joe Farrell. And and our job was to just play. It was a dance floor and a dividable room, and we just played jazz for dancing or private parties. We were on the fifth floor, and Kay Winding had the band downstairs. He had Al Foster and Earl May and Al Gaffa and Monty Alexander started out, and then in a couple of months he left, and Larry Willis came in, and that was a really good band. I spent all my time when we were off uh, when we took a break, I would run down there and listen to that band. Um, so after a while, they put us in one of the showrooms, and said there were two showrooms, and we just played mostly it would be like for a singer and a comedian for a week, and it would change every week. But then they put in a little improv group from California that had people that later became stars. Rob Reiner was in that group. And then they put in one thing they called the Floor of Fun, and it was like two women and two men, and we were on stage with them. And Lily Tomlin was one of the women. Nobody knew who she was at the time. She was doing commercials, and so when during our breaks, we would have quite long breaks in the showrooms. I would be sitting up and there was a sixth floor, like just a room with lockers for the bunnies and food and stuff for everybody that worked there, And so I'd be sitting up there with Lily, and we get to cutting up jokes and stuff. And if I'd say something that she really liked that was funny, she would whip out a check and write me a check for $10. She said, "I hate comedians that steal jokes from other people." So she said one day, she said, I've been making my living up until now doing TV and radio commercials, and she said, "You would be good at that. Why don't you do it? Just get somebody to do some headshots for you, and I'll turn you on." She had an agency called the Funny Face Brigade, and she sent me over there. I got this. I think I've got it on my website. My headshots. I dress up in some different costumes, and I started to get some work, but I didn't mind the posing at all, but getting the job was just dreadful. They would put out a call, and they call them cattle calls. About 400 people would show up, and one of their things would be they would put 2 or 3 people in a room with the director, or there would always be these 3 people that one from the ad agency, one from I don't know. It was always an argument like who was really in charge of these 3 from the product, or from the agency. Anyway, they would put 3 people in a room and say, well, now this is the situation. These people are so and so, and they're doing this. Now, just play with it, and so the people would improvise, and these people are writing it down and taking credit for writing the commercial. And one time they said they needed a bass player. I went down and I get off the elevator, and there's 15 bass players standing there with their basses, and I just got back on the elevator and went home. So I did do a couple of video commercials, but I got a lot of work with still photographers. This one guy that did a lot of things for medical magazines, and he liked the bags under my eyes, so he used me for the before pictures. But he also, I remember we did one thing for some auto company. They had 5 or 6 cars that they took out to the sand spit in the Rockaways and set this all up. We're all sitting there from like 2 in the afternoon, and they're waiting for sunset when the light is just a certain thing. And they rehearse this over and over again. And then this 10 minutes where the light is just right, they shot it, And another time I shot a bank commercial, and they paid me, but they didn't use the part they shot of me. There were 3 or 4 different scenes that they did. I finally said, what am I doing? I'm a bass player. So I stopped doing that.
Well, your music career kind of relied on so much serendipity in many ways that one thing led to the next, and
Yeah.
different instruments and different people and different locations. And it sounds like you opted for the best outcome of being a musician. So, and let me just say that, yeah, I know that your bags under your eyes are well earned and hard earned. So glad they service you in some way.
Yeah.
Well, I have to thank you for taking so much time today to chat with me. For anyone who has the opportunity to not only see other interviews, but there's a reason that you're so well respected and so appreciative. And anyone who speaks of you, Bill, is a fan, and you show great humor and a great joie de vivre, if you will. And I think that you have said humor is found in people everywhere, and that also the jazz should be fun. And I think you've shown that, it's garnered the respect of many around you, and also you do make everything fun. So thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, it's nice to talk to you.